A Russell Wilson decision will be coming soon, which is why you got to be subscribed to the channel. That way, when the news inevitably drops, whether he is staying or going, you are the first one to know. So help us reach 20,500 subscribers. And if you're already subscribed, turn on those notifications. Now, let's talk about the Russell Wilson interview on the I Am Athlete podcast. Coming up on today's show, we're going to talk about Russell Wilson's interview on former Broncos and Seahawks wide receiver Brandon Marshall's podcast, I Am Athlete, where he sat down and talked with Russell Wilson for over an hour. And I listened to the interview, and there were some interesting, nuggets that came out of it. And we're not going to run through the entire transcript of the podcast, but there were definitely some juicier parts of it that we're going to hit on. Now, if you haven't been able to tell, my voice is not really 100% there. I'm battling a cold right now. It's not a good time for me to get sick over the weekend during a bachelor party, but we're going to soldier on through, and we're going to talk about this interview on the podcast. So, one part I want to begin with is Russell Wilson talking about how he wants to win. And he said, for me, it's about winning. In the next 5 years, I want to win two Super Bowls, that is. I want to feel the chill of that trophy again. I love the city and everything else, but you also have to be in a place that loves you too. I want to win. That's all I care about. So Russell Wilson was very open and direct about wanting to stay in Denver with the Broncos. And honestly, props and major respect to Russ for wanting to stay with Denver despite what has been a very rocky, and that's putting it lightly, 2 years with the Broncos, right? I have definitely not been shy with my critiques of Russell Wilson. I was on board with the trade when it initially happened, and then how quickly things went downhill. But ultimately, for Russell Wilson to do a podcast after 2 years in Denver where it was very rough year one, he battled through and played through some injuries, but did miss a little bit of time. Then he comes back in year two, focuses on being the best version of himself, as he put it, lost some weight going into training camp, and looked like a younger version of himself. But ultimately, it didn't really last throughout the entire season, as we learned about what was a very tumultuous middle portion of the year where the Broncos approached him about removing some contract language, and ultimately that led to, in my eyes, him getting benched in the final 2 games of the season. But props to Russ, despite all that, still wanting to be a Bronco. He easily could have gone on there and go, listen, it's not working in Denver. I'm going to ask for my release. I'm going to ask to be traded, whatever it may be. But no, he wants to stay in Denver despite his coach benching him. Like, a lot of guys would have looked at that and gone, I want out of here. And a little part of me is like, Russ, why do you want to stay? Like, you could kind of look at it as like your girlfriend cheated on you and you still want to make this relationship work. Maybe you should go find a new relationship, right? I know that's a very loose analogy, but your coach did bench you. That's a lot of reasons and a lot of good reasons for a player to decide this is not where I want to be. So a little odd that he still wants to stay, but credit and bravo and respect to Russ for wanting to win in Denver before winning anywhere else. Ultimately, though, I don't think it is going to be in Denver. I just don't see a way you put the cat back in the bag after you benched him the last 2 weeks of the season. I never agreed with that move because $85 million is too big of a cap hit for me to stomach to go watch Jarrett Stidham start maybe week 1 of 2024. I don't see how you're making an improvement by that. But once you made that move, I don't think there's a way you can put the cat back in the bag, like I said. Now, Russell Wilson seemed open to returning. I mean, he was on board with it. If the Broncos will have him, despite his coach, Sean Payton came to Denver, is like, stop kissing babies. I don't think the two of them just got along, off the field wise. I don't think they were a great fit. I don't think they were a great mesh, which is a little bit bizarre since Sean Payton took that job knowing who the quarterback would be, and there were stories of Sean Payton wanting to trade for Russell Wilson when Drew Brees' time was winding down in New Orleans. But ultimately, I don't think those two were a very good match, and that's ultimately why Sean Payton partially moved on from Russell Wilson as his starting quarterback. Now, we can revisit the Russell Wilson timeline because it was very important that we have a good idea of how these events all went down, because Russell Wilson and the Broncos beat the Chiefs on October 29th, and the next day, the bye begins, and that's when Russell Wilson gets a phone call, and as he put it, he was surprised. He thought it was like a joke, or he couldn't really believe that the Broncos called him and asked will you remove this injury language from your contract so that you're not fully guaranteed money if you were to go down? And Russell Wilson said that was never going to happen because he didn't want to set a precedent for other players. And I'm not a player, so I'm not going to speak for players, but I can understand why Russell Wilson doesn't want to go up there or doesn't want to change the contract in his language or change the language in his contract, and open up a can of worms for other players down the line where, hey, even if you get injured, you might not get all that guaranteed money because, well, Russell Wilson started this trend of doing what's best for the team instead of himself. And if Russell Wilson suffered a major injury like Alex Smith did, as Brandon Marshall pointed out, he could have nothing essentially waiting for him in the future. Now, I want to look at some more quotes from the podcast interview. I think you guys might enjoy this part here. Russell Wilson said, "My agent talked to the NFLPA. The NFLPA called me and asked, and then they talked to the NFL. And the NFL was like, this is illegal. You can't do this." So that was in response to the Broncos asking Russell Wilson to change the injury language in his contract. NFL said to the Broncos, this is illegal. You can't do this. Now, Andrew Mason from Denver Sports wrote an article reacting to this podcast, and he said in it, according to a source with knowledge, the NFL did not convey such sentiments regarding the situation. This is what we need clarity on because the Broncos have maintained the stance of we benched Russell Wilson because of football-related reasons, right? Looking for a spark on offense. It had nothing to do with the contract. Russell Wilson's camp, and I intend to side with Russell Wilson's camp on this one, say this wasn't a football move. Like, they had won 5 straight games not too long before Russell Wilson was benched on, the 27th of December? This was a move because of Russell Wilson's contract in Denver going, all right, we're going to play with fire here and keep Russell Wilson as our quarterback because we are winning games and we did this silent, little standoff during the bye week and neither side blinked and ultimately it was the Broncos who caved in and go, all right, you can stay our starting quarterback. We're not going to bench you after all. But once Denver lost to New England on Christmas Eve and they were basically eliminated from the playoffs, then they decided, well, the last thing we want to see is Russell Wilson get hurt in a meaningless game and guarantee money in 2024 and 2025. So let's pull the plug on him since we didn't do it earlier and our bet or gamble kind of paid off because he didn't get injured in those games. But now there's no sense in playing him in meaningless games if we are, even though they weren't technically mathematically eliminated, they had like a 1% chance. So let's not risk 2024 and 2025 for meaningless games at the end of 2023. But that part right there about whether or not the NFL went to the Broncos and said, this is illegal, you can't do this, that's what we need some clarity on. And we also need clarity on what the conversations were truly like between the Broncos and Russell Wilson because we've only heard Russell Wilson's side, the media side, but not the Broncos side. And that's the last piece of the puzzle because we all know that there's one person's story, another person's story, and the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. All right, before we get on to the rest of this podcast reaction, I do want to share some awesome information and some new information about our sponsor today, which is Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. The easiest and most exciting way to play DFS because it's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. Football season is over, but the action on the floor is heating up. Whether it's tournament season or the fight for the playoff home court, there's no shortage of high-stakes basketball moments this time of the year. Get in on the excitement with Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app, where you can turn your hoops knowledge into serious cash. Prize Picks, by the way, even offers injury insurance so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player projection won't count against you and the rest of your entry stays alive. Now, I'm a big seam head. I love baseball, and Prize Picks, they've got options out there for baseball lovers as well. So if you want to make some season-long stat projections like I am, come ride with me at prizepicks.com/CLNS and use code CLNS for a first-time deposit match. Download the app today and use code CLNS for a first deposit match up to $100. This is Prize Picks. All that information is in the comments and description of today's video. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy with Prize Picks. Back to the Russell Wilson interview on the I Am Athlete podcast. Russell Wilson said that when he won the standoff with the Broncos and came back from the bye week, not sure if he'd be the starter or not. Sean Payton went up to him and said, hey, forget it. Like nothing happened. You're going to play this week against Buffalo. We've got a big game against Buffalo. We've got to go win on Monday night. I'm like, all right. So props to Russell Wilson for not budging. Ultimately, he won the battle, I would say, but the Broncos probably won the war since, well, they ultimately did end up benching Russell Wilson later on in the season, and it does feel like Russell Wilson's time in Denver is over, but Russell Wilson stood by his guns, and he's like, I'm not going to remove the injury language from my contract because, like I said earlier, he does not want to set a bad precedent for players bending the knee to teams and to remove very valuable language in contracts that protects them and protects their livelihood and their families and their future in case they suffer a horrific injury, which has happened, well, more often than we care to see in the National Football League. So major bravo and kudos to Russell Wilson for standing by that contract because, sure, he wasn't living up to that, but ultimately that doesn't mean he should change it. Like, if he thinks he's worth that, then why should he change it if it's the middle of the season and it's just going to potentially injure his future earnings based on him playing football for this team when guys are out there all the time playing through injuries? Like Russell Wilson talked about playing through a torn lat and how he should have missed a lot more time in 2022 and how he came back early in 2021 back in Seattle. So the guy has played through some serious injuries before. Maybe it's all even that this time when a team is looking for a player to help them out and remove some injury language from the contract, he goes, you know what? I played through a lot of injuries before. How about I keep that injury language in my contract because it probably is due for me to not benefit you guys already more than I already am by playing through injuries. Now, pick one to keep for me. Russell Wilson or Sean Payton. If you had to pick one to keep for 2024, who would you rather have on the Broncos? Quarterback or the head coach? I'm very curious to see which one of these gets some more votes. Now, Brandon Marshall also brought up some next team odds with Russell Wilson, and he wanted to get his take on which of these next four teams he would like to go to. And Russell Wilson said, first and foremost, number one is the Denver Broncos. So he still is doing his absolute best to stay in Denver. But you got the Steelers, you got the Raiders, the Falcons, and the Patriots, and these odds are from DraftKings. But you can see there's a huge drop-off after the Pittsburgh Steelers to the next highest odds, the Las Vegas Raiders. And not to be super chalky, but I think the Pittsburgh Steelers do make the most sense for Russell Wilson, right? They made the playoffs last year despite having horrible quarterback play, and that wasn't by accident. Like, that was Kenny Pickett as their starter, and then they ultimately kind of benched Kenny Pickett towards the end. Like, I think if Mason Rudolph got hurt, Kenny Pickett easily could have played, but they wanted to ride with the hot hand despite that decision being made partially because Kenny Pickett got injured, and they still limped into the playoffs because they had a really good defense and they got some really good pieces on the rest of the offense. They just did not have good quarterback play. You take Russell Wilson, what he did last year for Denver, and you put that in Pittsburgh's offense. Like, I don't think that's an offense that's going to go out there and win a bunch of playoff games, but I do think that's an offense and that's a defense in Pittsburgh that can go to the playoffs again and probably be a little bit more competitive than they were against the Buffalo Bills. But ultimately, I don't think if we're doing a little bit of segment on the Pittsburgh Steelers offseason, there is an opportunity for them this offseason to make a major upgrade at the quarterback spot to be serious contenders in the AFC. Russell Wilson is probably their best option. There's not a lot of great options out there since they are picking so late in the draft. They can't get one of the top-tier quarterbacks. But if they do want to find an improvement over Kenny Pickett and Mason Rudolph, Russell Wilson is that guy, and he can come in super duper cheap on a vet minimum deal. So where do you guys think Russell Wilson will play in 2024? Pittsburgh Steelers, Denver Broncos. Let me know which team down below you think Russell Wilson will end up suiting up for next offseason. All right. Honestly, shout out to everyone still watching right now. This has not been the greatest edition of the Broncos Breakdown just because of my voice sounding so nasally. I'm so congested right now for my cold. Hopefully I kick it by tomorrow and we are back to smooth sailing. But shout out to everyone for powering through what has been a pretty rough episode in terms of the audio quality on my end. But I appreciate you guys watching all the way to the end of the video. And if you're still watching, type DEN in the comment section. That way I can give you a shout out because you guys deserve some sort of award for watching all this way.